Okay, in this video, I'm going to go over how to create an embossed effect within Substance Painter. So here I have this logo and I just made this pattern. We cut in, but then we also have this like kind of soft lip going on. And I'll have some reference here. So here's a reference. So it depends on how we're embossing, but in the case of leather, we are working on skin. So leather is just animal skin, and it has a soft material. And then usually when you're doing this embossing effect, what you're doing is you're using some kind of metal tool that when you punch in, it cuts. So you can see it cuts the edges. So the actual shape is very clean, but then it has these soft rounded edges as the skin is pulled and stretched and kind of folded over to in order to make that shape. So I'm looking at a couple references. Some of these are fake. You got to be aware of that. But yeah, so something like this is kind of what we're going for. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and walk through the layers. So we're going to come out to here. I'm going to turn off all the layers and turn one on at a time. So my first thing is I have my pattern. And so on this pattern layer, I just called it color. It doesn't need height, doesn't need metal. All it really needs is color and roughness in my case. So I just essentially grabbed this leather roughness material or rough leather material, and I just made the material a little rougher, made it a little bit darker, set the color to multiply. And then inside of here, I just assembled my logo. So this is going to be where my logo and everything's going to be at. So the way I made this work is I dropped in an image, right? I just imported it and dropped it in. So here it is. I just used the UV transform to move it and then turned repeat off on UV wrap. Otherwise it does that. So I set it to none. Problem is the background is you see there's like a border to it. So what I did was I just flooded uh, underneath it with white or black, depending on what your image is. And then I just inverted it because white means turn this layer on. Okay. And then I wanted to add some text. So all I did was add a fill layer, and the newer versions of Substance Painter have these fonts over here. So I just dropped the font into that fill layer right there, and I just typed in dogs or something. And you can change the font later inside of here, just drag and drop to replace it. Probably set this to middle, but it doesn't really matter. Everything else is good. I didn't really play around with it too much, but I did the same thing where I just wanted to place it into the middle. I like to add a little bit of distortion a lot of times because often, things end up feeling a little too perfect. So, you can use something like a warp just to kind of like distort the shape. And so that just makes the edges a little less perfect. So that's usually a good technique for things that are more organic. And then the last thing I need to do is I need to add a anchor point. So what I did in here, I just right clicked and add anchor point and named it engraving mask. You name it whatever you want to. And then that's going to let me grab this pattern, this image right here, and I can use it in all these other layers. Okay, so I'm just essentially taking that same image and I'm just playing around with it, doing different image adjustments or filters on top of it to get cool effects. So that's my initial color effect. So I have my color layer, a little bit of roughness. If we go back and look at those examples, right, one of the things I noticed was there's a little bit of color variation. So there's a lot of times when they'll do this embossing, they'll do it with like a heated metal element. So you'll notice it flattens the material. So like it flattens and that, and then it has like kind of a burning effect sometimes. That's not always the case, but I wanted to go ahead and add that in. So this is what that layer looks like. And so this one's pretty simple. What it is I just duplicate the layer, set it to multiply for the color and just only have color. And on this one, I just took that same image and I just did like a little bit of an edge detection with some variation to it. So it looks something like this. So again, going back down through this, I just added a fill layer. So we right click and say add fill layer. We're going to go ahead and grab that anchor point, so that engraving mask. So that's just grabbing this same image here, bringing it up here. I'll delete that one and use this original one. Okay. In order to do the edge highlighting effect, so inside of these references, right, there's like a lot of edge detection stuff going on where the interior, in this case, the interior edges are looking a little darker. So in order to do edge detection, you have a couple options. First is you can do a high pass filter, which is what I did here. A second option would be doing a edge outlining effect, so mask outline. So if you come in here, you could do, I'm just going to show mask outline. It's not the one I did, but you can do mask outline. You bring the width down, threshold. You can just soften it a little bit. And that does a pretty good job. But I personally just like high pass. They're very similar. You just have to manipulate them differently. So when you do a high pass filter, this is essentially like a sharpening or edge detection filter. So you can see it highlights one side of an edge and darkens the other, which is really cool. So it lets you isolate the outside and inside, depending on what you want to do. And so then what you do with this is, if you play with the radius, it's going to be a bigger spread or a tighter edge. So you can see it's very sharp the lower the radius is. And then I added the levels. So the levels, I need to get this to not be gray, right? Because I don't want this effect on this whole layer, right? You can see it's darkening everything, right? So I just want to darken the inside. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a levels node, and I'm going to play with these values and raise either the min or max until I isolate the area I want. So if I brought this down here, you can see it does that. Or if I want to bring it down here, it'll do that. So you can see I'm making everything that was gray black and everything that was lighter than gray white. If I need to select the outside, I can just invert that and then just change this. And so now I'm selecting the outside of the shape. So it's pretty versatile. So let's just go ahead and re-invert that. So that's all I did right here. It's just I added a levels node. I added a little variation to it. And then for this one, I'm going to get rid of this for a second, but we'll come back to it. So let's take a look at this. So we have this edge detection. As always, I like to add a little variation and maybe even some lost and found. So in this case, I added blur slope. But one of the problems with blur slope is you might notice, so if we go to the base color, the blur slope is causing this to spill outside of the shape. But I want this to be only inside of the embossed marking, right? So in order to control that, what I did was I came in here and I have this, just took this layer down here. So this is the exact same layer as here where I'm just grabbing that engraving mask. And all I'm really doing is I'm setting it to multiply. So what multiply does is wherever this image right here is black, it's going to darken the layers below with that black. Wherever it's white, it's going to not affect the layers below. So if I set that to multiply, then all those black pixels in this layer are going to essentially erase or eat away all of the stuff that overlaps it. So that helps me keep it within the shape of the model. So I use that very frequently, as I just use that same image and set it to either subtract, screen, or multiply in order to like keep my original shape or contain all the effects I'm doing inside of it. Okay. So this is my color breakup. I did add in this layer right here. The reason why I weighted off on this a little bit was, it would have made this a little bit more confusing, I think. But I just added a paint layer in just because I felt like I wanted a little bit more of that value contrast, or that value in here. So I just used a paintbrush with a low flow, just a soft brush, and I just came in here and I just kind of added a little variation to it, just to make it feel a little bit more organic. Okay. And so that's my color breakup, or my color darkening layer. Next is I did my punch, and actually this is usually the thing I do second, but just the way my layers are ordered, this is not actually second. So this is my main height layer. So for this height layer, what I'm doing is it's just height. I'm just pushing it in. You can see the more I push it, the greater this punch is going in. I don't want to push it too far, but just adding a little bit of that. And so when you take a look at this, if I come in here, you can see it has this cut, but it also has a blur to it. So if I look in here in this layer, I'm going to go ahead and go down to here. So if we just use just the logo, the embossing, right, it looks something like that, right? So that feels very unnatural if you look at these references, because again, like I mentioned, there's like a bit of a slope here, right? There's like a soft kind of pilling or pillowing going on right here. You can see it's like a kind of a soft round, but this right here is just a hard drop off. It goes flat, and then it has like almost like a cliff that it falls off. It's like a plateau. So what I did was I needed to kind of spread this out and soften this shape. So what I did was, in order to spread it out, I used a bevel node. So it looks like that. So bevel is nice because what bevel does is it will help you spread or shrink in your shape fairly linearly. It has another effect, right? When you look at this, you can see it almost creates kind of like a really sharp 45-degree angle slope. And so if I come in here and play around with that, you can see it has like a linear slope that goes down like that. So that's pretty cool. It's really helpful for growing and shrinking shapes. So I used that to kind of grow my shape a little bit. And then what I did was I added a blur. So that blur is going to be the thing that gives it kind of like that smooth kind of hill to it. And just gives it that nice soft fall off. The last thing I do is I recut my shape in, because what happens is just with, and let's remove the bevel for a second. You don't necessarily need the bevel. But when I do this blur, right, the engraving shape, if I got rid of the color and that color breakup, you can see that engraving shape's just a little soft, right? And so we don't have that punch that I was mentioning before. We have that really nice cut going on to it. So in order to get that cut back into it, what I did was I just, again, came in here and I grabbed it's the same layer as this one right here. So we just added a fill layer. So add fill. We go ahead and grab that anchor point. So engraving mask. In this case, I'm going to subtract it. So it's going to take the white pixels and subtract from below. Or actually, sorry, linear dodge add. So it's going to add to the layers below. So what that does is you'll see it gives me that sharp cut. And if I don't want that punch to be so hard, then what I can do is I can just bring the opacity down a little bit. So we can still see that sharpness, but it's less opaque. So you can see that. And it just looks like this. When I hold Alt and click on this, it looks like this, right? Just kind of bringing that edge back. Okay. And then this one right here that's the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that and just bring this one back in. Okay. And then we'll use that bevel. That bevel's just so I can get more of like a hill or distance away. It's up to you. And then what I did is I was going to grab this because I might need it later on. So let's bring the color back. Okay. And I'd say that warp is going a little hard for me. So I'm just going to kind of reduce that just a little bit. Okay. So we'll come back over here. All right, so we got our depth, our main depth here. And so, and again, I can just play with that, this height value just to kind of emphasize the displacement in. I also have this right here, which pushes out. So this is kind of like an opportunity for me to counteract or add kind of like pilling and bunching, right? So if like I punch this in, maybe the mass is like pushed over and so this bulges out somewhere else. So this one is, debatable whether you want to use this or not, but it's kind of doing the same thing as the layer below, but instead of pushing in, it's pushing up. And so for this layer, so we have this one, right, where we're pushing in, and this layer right here, we're selecting everything outside of it. So this one is just, again, I'm taking this fill layer. I'm doing a high pass. What I might want to do is I might even want to do a bevel first to let that spread out just a little bit. I could just do a little smoothing. So we use that high pass, then use the levels node to grab the white areas there. Add a little warp, and then I went ahead and blurred it and then cut that back in. And so this is what it looks like, where we're just adding a little bit more mass and volume in some of those areas. I'll exaggerate it so you can see it. So it's kind of like that. So I don't know if you necessarily need it, but that's something I wanted to add. And then of course, well, in this case I had that warp, but then if I didn't have that warp, it would be a little too perfect. We can try pushing the warp a bit more to see what we get. So we'll just go ahead and play around with that. So that can add a little bit of noise, which is nice. And then I added a paint layer, which in this case isn't doing a whole lot, but you can come in here and let's see, if I paint on here, let's go ahead and use a higher flow. You can see I can like manually paint in like if I want a little bit of height somewhere or if I want to erase it. So I might come in here and just like fill this in like right around there. That's kind of it's really whatever you want to do. But anyways, so I just added that in there. So I got the push up. One thing I wanted to do was I wanted to add a little bit of texture to here. So I kind of added like a grainy texture to it. So you can see here I had this like kind of bumpy, pebbly texture to kind of emphasize that kind of cut leather feeling. So in here just looks something like this. I might even take this and then change that balance a bit. And then contrast, let's go ahead and take that height and just bring it down a little bit. So something like that. And then we can bring that roughness up just a bit. Maybe bring that color down a little bit. So this is just to add a little bit more texture in there. And you can change that up however you want to. One thing I do want to take a moment to bring up is that if I look at the height layer on these, so if we come over to height, you'll see they're all set to linear dodge add, except for, or actually, and that's totally fine. But one of the problems is if I came in here and let's go ahead and we're going to add in a fill layer with just height. I'll push that height up. You can see I'm using displacement. And we're just going to add like folds or creases or something like that. So we're just going to go ahead and have this as a mask. And let's go ahead and tile it. And we're going to go ahead and increase the contrast. There we go. All right, so one thing you may notice is that the folds are getting inside. And so that might be the effect you want, but if you want to override the height below, so by default, the height is set to linear dodge. And if you look at linear dodge, it says add. So it just adds all the information to the layer below. That includes negative information. And so if I want to, let's go ahead and get rid of the color so you can see that a little bit better in that roughness, because that roughness is hiding it a little bit. But if I want to override that, then what I can do, or what I might want to do, is I might want to set my my blend mode for my heights to normal. So what normal does is it essentially will override the height. And so in this case, let's go ahead and I'm going to come in here and set the height, turn the height on. So you can see by default, this one, its height, I'm going to set the height range to 0, keep its height position there. So that's just going to keep it neutral. So it's not actually going to move very much. And so you can see when I turn that on and I set that to just normal blending mode in the height, it just overrides the height completely. And that also pertains to normals, right? So if you have anything in your normals, it's set to normal detail right here. So if you just set it to normal, it'll override the normals underneath it. So it's really handy if you want something to like kind of completely cover or block a layer below. So we're just going to get rid of that though. We don't need that. Okay. So we got that texture. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of an edge lightning effect, and you can kind of see that in some of these examples here, right? You can see the edge gets a little bit lighter. Same thing with that one. Let's look at some of those more realistic, or the more real ones. Something like this. So you can see it gets like a little bit of stress and that kind of color going on, which is nice. So in order to do that one, it's very similar to all the other ones where I'm just taking that same mask and I'm doing blurring or edge detection or something like that. So if we take a look at this, I'm going to come in here. So again, we grab this. In this case, I grabbed my my height one, but I really don't need that one. I could just choose the engraving mask. So we can grab that one. And then what I did was just add a high pass layer to do some edge detection. I inverted it and then clamped it with a levels node in order to get the outside parts right there. And if I come out and look at it, you can see it looks something like that. And with that high pass filter, you can see the more I increase the radius, the larger it spreads out away from it. So I'm just going to do that. And then what I did then is I just blurred it. Only problem is, again, if we look at this it's getting inside the shape, but I want it to be on this outside part, right? Because when I look at my reference there, right, all the lightning's on the outside of the shape. So then what I did was I just went ahead and subtracted the original shape. So again, we put the shape here. We brought that anchor point in as a fill layer, and I'm just going to set it to subtract. And so that just cuts it out. And you could add in a little bit of clouds with multiply for good measure, just to add a little variation so it's not as perfect. But that's just that layer right there. And so that's the basics of engraving. So, by having this split into multiple layers, so you can see I set my color and different height effects into different layers, then it gives me a lot of control, right? Because if I want to make the depth less intense, right, I can come in here, or if I want that to be like a softer pilling, I can come in here, go to that blur or the bevel and just change the shape of that, right, to make it like sharper or softer. I have this separate effect of this kind of like extra push up. The edge lightning is in its own layer. This texture and this color breakups in its own layer. So anchor points and being able to control that with multiple layers, and you can see I put it all in a folder, makes this a lot easier for me to come in and tweak. And the cool thing about this too is I can come in here and I can add in another fill layer. We can set this to linear dodge add, and then I can grab another image and I can modify the image I have and just um, make whatever I want, right? So let's go ahead and drop that on there. I'm going to go ahead and turn this to none, and I'm going to go ahead and change this to warp projection, and I'm going to go ahead and click on the surface tool, and we'll just go ahead and come and take a look at this. So we'll just surface tool here, and we'll scale it down. And I set it to, oh, let me go ahead and do that. Linear dodge add, there we go. So if I just want to add that there, now I have another shape in there, and I can play around with it and do whatever I want, and keep modifying it. So having all that flexibility is really nice. Another thing I might want to do is I might want to do something like edge frame. So I've done this with things like if I wanted to like punch a raw hole. So let's say let me go ahead and pause and create a raw hole really quickly. Okay, here we go. Just using the same philosophy, what I did was I created a hole. I just used like a little bit of an alpha of technique in order to punch the hole so there's nothing there. You don't have to do this, but I just use specular level to make that not reflect anything. So it's black with no reflections. But you can do alpha or opacity cutout too. I did a little edge lift just to kind of emphasize the hole, like it's a torn hole. And it's like a thin piece of leather. And then here, all I really did was I just came in and grabs that hole shape using the anchor point. So I have an anchor point here, circle mask. So this one right here. So it came up here. Again, did high pass to do a little edge detection, inverted that, and used levels to clamp it down. And then to make it kind of messy and torn, I just use a blur slope. So that blur slope is letting me kind of get that kind of frayed, haggard look. And actually sometimes do multiple blur slopes on top of each other or warps. So you might have a blur slope for like large shapes. So we'll take a look at this. And then we're going to have a blur slope. This one right here is going to be smaller shapes. And so I'm just going to bring that intensity down to like 100. And so if we take a look at this, let's make that source tiling a little bit larger. And we'll just bring that up a bit more. So maybe get a little bit more hairy. You can also set these to linear dodge add, so that just adds to the layer below if you want to, but in this case, I don't know if I really need to do that. Let's just set it back to replace. And maybe I just need to turn up the blur or change the scale or change the intensity just a bit. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's maybe bring this intensity down a little bit more. And I'm kind of looking at it from far away. And then I just added a little bit of breakup to it by multiplying on or subtracting this layer right here. And if I don't want it to be everywhere, again, I can go ahead and grab a paint layer and just paint black to only have it on parts of my mesh. So maybe not everywhere is going to have it. But you can see it kind of creates this like hairy feathered look, which is kind of cool. But anyways, yeah, so that's the same principle that I did on everything else. We can control that height, just doing a little bit of height to pop off. And so yeah, that's essentially the gist of doing embossing and engraving effects and using anchor points to achieve it.